going to verse 3 of chapter 47. In those days I saw the head of days as he took his seat on the throne of his glory, and the books of the living were opened in his presence, and all his hosts, which was in the heights of heaven, and his court were standing in his presence. Okay, I've never read an ancient text with a more clear description of the opening of the judgment of the living in heaven than that. The books of the living were opened in his presence, the presence of the head of days, and all his hosts, which was in the heights of heaven, and his court were standing in his presence. So this is clearly the heavenly court. The hosts of heaven gathered, standing in his presence in the heights of heaven, and it refers to it as his court. This is very clearly the judgment scene, and it's the books of the living that are open. And of course, in the context of the parables, this is all about the investigative judgment for the living and the judicial judgment for the living, judicial phase, I should say, of the judgment for the living, and the execution of the judgment for the living. This is all about the judgment for the living. But it talks about the one who's doing this judgment for the living is the Son of Man. And so far, what have we learned about the Son of Man? Well, he is the chosen one who dwells in the presence of the Lord of Spirits, also called the Head of Days. He is called the Righteous One. Righteousness is a characteristic element of what he is all about. He is the one to reveal the treasuries of what has been hidden. He is the one who overturns the power of the rulers of the earth who oppress his people. And he is the one whose blood is presented before the presence of the Lord of living ones. So now we have the books of the living open. So we have this heavenly court scene. The Son of Man is there. His blood is presented. And the books of the living are opened. And now what happens? Going on to the next verse. That was verse 3. And the books of the living were opened in his presence, and all his host, which was in the heights of heaven, and his court were standing in his presence. And the hearts of the holy ones were filled with joy, for the number of the righteous was at hand. So, at hand being like, it's right there, about to happen. And the prayer of the righteous had been heard, and a reckoning of the blood of the righteous one had been required in the presence of the Lord of living ones. In that place, I saw the spring of righteousness, and it was inexhaustible, and many springs of wisdom surrounded it, and all the thirsty drank from them and were filled with wisdom, and their dwelling places were with the righteous and holy and the chosen. So, judgment of the living opens, springs of wisdom and righteousness issuing forth, and the thirsty drink from the springs and are filled with wisdom. By the way, I have to share this one parallel because, the Odes of Solomon we've seen to be so very important. Oh, and I actually don't have it with me, but 1 second. I can pull it up quickly on my computer. The Odes of Solomon are so very important, and we've seen that they have such a connection with Jesus. And, okay, there we are. Okay, look at this parallel, just so you can see, there's clearly some sort of influence here. 1 Enoch 48, verse 1. And all the thirsty, okay, actually, I'll read it a little bit before this. In that place I saw the spring of righteousness, and it was inexhaustible, and many springs of wisdom surrounded it, and all the thirsty drank from them and were filled with wisdom. Okay, so in the Odes of Solomon, Ode 6, verse 11, it's talking about springs of water issuing forth, and it talks about how it spread over the whole earth. And then in verse 11 it says, then all the thirsty upon the earth drank, and thirst was relieved and quenched. For from the Most High the drink was given. Blessed, therefore, are the ministers of that drink who have been entrusted with his water. So, I mean, that's just one, really oh, wow. The Odes really share this language, and there are other instances of that as well, which I probably won't mention when we get to it. But here you have the judgment for the living open in heaven, a spring of righteousness and many springs of wisdom surrounding it, and all the thirsty drink and are filled with wisdom. And then it says, and in that hour, an hour is the smallest unit of time in the ancient world. So at that moment, or in that hour, in that hour, that Son of Man was named in the presence of the Lord of living ones. Mm-hmm. Now that's very interesting, and all branches should find that very interesting because...
Repeat it for them.
Sure. So I'll repeat this again, and you guys think of why might this be interesting for us. So the judgment for the living is opened, springs of righteousness and wisdom issue forth, and then the Son of Man is named in the presence of the Lord of spirits, or the Lord of living ones. So, of course, the branch teaching, and even prior to branch teaching specifically, Victor Hoddeth, he talked about how the judgment of the living would begin at the end of the 430 years. And then he also said that at the end of the 430 years, the new name would be given. Well, here, this is the only text which I know of from the ancient world which spells out that when the judgment for the living opens, the Son of Man would be given a name.
Cool.
Yeah, super cool. Super cool. So, yeah, that's okay, definitely
noteworthy.
Yes, definitely noteworthy. That should definitely draw our attention. But it's interesting because then it says something else, which I also find very interesting in light of the new name of Jesus being Branch. So it says, in that hour, the Son of Man was named in the presence of the Lord of living ones, and his name before the head of days. Even before the sun and the constellations were created, before the stars of heaven were made, his name was named before the Lord of living ones. The first time I read this, before I understood that this isn't actually a book of Enoch, and it's not like this is one book and all of that, I was so confused by this. But I had read this before, and I noticed that it has the naming of the Son of Man when the judgment for living opens. And clearly when the judgment for the living opens, it's describing the judgment for the living in terms of the judgment of the stars. So the stars are already in existence, the stars and all of that, and it's talking about the righteous and the wicked. But then it says, even before the sun and the constellations were made, before the stars of heaven were made, his name was named before the Lord of living ones. Now, what that is saying is that even though he was named, like the name was given to him, he was named when the judgment for the living opens, that his name was appointed before any of this was made. It's not saying that the event of the judgment opening is before any of this stuff, because that would contradict every bit of the description of the judgment for the living, where you have all the stars being judged and all of that. And so it's what it's doing. It's like a parenthetical note saying that he's given this name at this appointed time, but this name was appointed before any of this was.